Welcome to the First Buck Podcast, where we feature stories about entrepreneurs and the people who support them. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hello, and welcome to the First Buck Podcast, brought to you by sky'sthelimit.org. We feature stories about entrepreneurs and the people that support them. Today, we're joined by Seth Levine, a partner and co-founder at Foundry Group, focusing on making early-stage technology investments, participating in select growth rounds, and identifying and supporting the next generation of venture fund managers. In addition to his work at Foundry, Seth is an active global entrepreneurial ecosystem participant and a founding board member of the Unreasonable Institute, an advisor to the Palestinian-focused venture fund Sadara, an advisor to Lagos-based Ingressive Capital, as well as an advisor and mentor to a number of other venture funds and companies globally. Lastly, Seth is a published author. His recent book, The New Builders, tells the stories of the next generation of entrepreneurs. Seth is a very busy guy, so we're very lucky to have him today. Seth, we've got a little tradition around here. Can you tell us how you earned your first buck?
I love it. Nick, first, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. It's funny. You told me you were going to ask me that question, and I like three different things popped to mind, but
I can tell from your resume, I bet it would be hard to figure out where it started.
Yeah, and I don't remember which was first, but I grew up scrappy and trying to make a little bit of money. I think my favorite example, and it probably was my first buck, was I raked and shoveled snow when I was a kid for the neighborhood, and I realized when I was snow shoveling, I was probably I must have still been in grade school, maybe it was sixth, seventh grade, something like that. But I had this deal where people would pay me a fixed rate. I grew up in the Northeast, and so some years it snowed a lot, some years did not. And I had a bunch of people who paid me a fixed rate on a monthly basis, and I would shovel their snow, every time it snowed. And I got to that by just, going door to door and asking people, if I could shovel their walk for $5. And I had a couple people that sort of would be like, well, come to me first, right? Next time. And I was like, well, how about you become a subscription, or a subscriber to, whatever Seth's shoveling. Eventually I actually had a couple friends working for me. So I would grab them when it snowed, and I would pay them hourly. And anyway, it was not a particularly big operation, but it certainly worked well.
I love it. Snow shoveling as a service. It's like predates SaaS. Perfect.
Absolutely. Yeah, the original SaaS. No,
exactly. All right, cool. So let's talk a little bit about your professional career. From the time you went on from shoveling snow to going to school and graduating, maybe talk to us a little bit about kind of the pivotal moments that helped you evolve into greater amounts of responsibility.
Yeah, well, the first pivotal moment was actually what got me away from academia and into business. I was a psychology major and sort of like a theoretical econ major. I went to school in the Midwest, and I went to this sort of lecture series that was a really big deal. It was a political science thing. It was like an endowed series or something like that. And they brought in this professor from Northwestern who was going to talk about welfare policy. And I thought, well, that sounds really interesting. I was good friends with someone who was like a student who was on the committee. There was a big dinner, big to do. And the lecture was in the chapel. It was standing room only. It was probably 500 people sitting and standing in the chapel to listen to this woman speak. And she kept promising she was going to have some like policy thing that she was going to talk about. She got to the end, and she didn't really have it, right? She had we should value, work more, or something very generic. Not that I disagreed with it, but it was like that. There's no policy there. So anyway, it was a little disappointing. So like 2 days later, there was another lecture, not a big series. There was no dinner beforehand, but a woman who had been on welfare. She wrote and pulled herself out of welfare, a single mother, by her bootstraps, and she had written a book about it. And I thought, well, this will be a perfect juxtaposition to the academic side of, hey, this woman studied welfare, and then here's this woman that lived welfare, happened to be in the same chapel, so same setting. I might have been one of 15 people that showed up to that. And that was a moment when like everything changed for me, where I was like, I don't want to be in the fancy room with the 500 people talking about it theoretically. I want to be in the room where people who have experienced it are actually trying to do something about it, right? And so it totally changed my life, Nick. Like I mean, I was going to go to grad school for psychology and be a professor. And it was that moment where I just decided, you know what, this isn't what I want to do with my life. So fortunately I had enough time, and it was an econ major too, which was helpful. This was a long time ago. So there was like only so many jobs you can go get that were like business type jobs after school. But that's what set me on the track. I decided to go do something completely different. I ended up getting a job at an investment bank, which was an interesting experience in and of itself. But you know, that's kind of what set me on this business experience. I had the great fortune of, really true fortune of getting lucky a bunch of times in my business life. One of which was I worked for a big bank in New York. They offered to let me skip business school, which by the way, getting that job was near impossible. And that's maybe a story for another podcast, but it was a very interesting experience. Not the greatest experience as an analyst, right? It was a lot of 80 and 100-hour weeks, but they actually offered to let me stay and skip business school. And I was about to do that and just remain a banker. And for a bunch of different reasons, didn't do that. I ended up calling a company that I'd done some work for. It was in Colorado. I wanted to move there. My grandparents, were there, and I wanted to spend more time with them. And he offered me a job. I ended up working for this guy that gave me a ton of responsibility. I did a lot of M&A. I was, doing really large M&A deals when I was, in my sort of early 20s, if you will. And then my boss left and restarted another company. He pulled me in to do corporate development for them. And I think 3 days after I start, he fired the guy that was the CFO essentially, because he didn't, trust him or something like that. Said, I want you to do that job, right? It wasn't a CFO title. It was the corporate finance half of the CFO job. And then there was an accounting, he hired a chief accounting officer and we split the job. And, and again, I'm in kind of my mid 20s. And so, I had a chance to do that. And we actually went public and sort of in the height of the bubble. And I led that process, raised a bunch of other money from some other investors. And we had Texas Pacific was one of our investors, and just a lot of interesting people. And then they decided after the bubble kind of burst, they changed their business model and they were going to go sort of focus on one part of the business. They put the entirety of the rest of the business underneath me, and had me run it for about a year while I kind of cleaned it up and then sold it in a couple pieces. So I got this great operating experience where I ran a $55 million business, had, 250 people reporting up through my organization. And that was also a really interesting experience. And then after that, I got incredibly lucky because someone introduced me to a guy named Brad Feld, who many of your listeners probably know about. And I ended up kind of taking a big step back in my career. I did it very purposely, but I thought, I want to try this venture capital thing. And Brad, I ended up working for Brad for probably 4 or 5 years. And he was an incredible person to learn from. And then again, lucky because I went to Brad and sort of quit, like quiet quit, and said, hey, I'm not going to quit today, but I just want you to know I'm not going to stay at the firm was called Mobius. I'm not going to stay at Mobius. I'm sort of like I've been promoted to this like super junior partner. And I just said, I appreciate the opportunity I've had here, but basically, I was married, I had a kid at that point. I was like, I got to go be on a different trajectory here. This isn't really, I don't want to be a tiny partner. I get to do 1 or 2 deals in this fund. And he said, well, actually, I don't know the fund's coming together, but I think I'd like to go do something. What do you think about joining me? And I thought, well, that sounds pretty interesting. So that's yeah, right. So that's what started the conversation that ended up being Foundry. So it was, I think what I'm describing to you, Nick, is a lot of luck in a lot of different places. And I don't know what would have happened, right? And it's sliding doors if things had gone differently, but I'm sure happy they went the way that they did.
Well, it's interesting to hear you have that pivotal moment, in the audience in a small room where you sort of become reminded that lived experience, stepping into the arena is where you're going to really be tested. And the consequences are more palpable, and you really learn to add all these lessons across your career, and they prepare you for the next thing. And for anyone that doesn't know, Brad Feld wrote really a definitive book about fundraising for entrepreneurs that are seeking venture capital. And it's one of the books I recommend to almost everybody I talk to who's a young entrepreneur that's thinking about facing off against venture capitalists. So a great read. And I don't think I ever knew the founding story for you guys. So I'm glad to have learned that today. So a follow-up question to that is, I think we got through like the kind of pivotal, pylons through that story, but can you maybe hone in on one where you had to take a risk and it was scary at the time. It was an investment of either, the company's capital or one of the businesses that you were involved with. And which one led to sort of like the biggest ROI, and what were sort of the most important lessons from that experience that you would convey to others about taking risk and in what to look out for?
Yeah. Well, let me tell you the rest of the story about founding Foundry, because that was probably the biggest risk that I took. Right. I mean, I was married. I think we had 2 kids at that point, and it is not inexpensive to start a venture fund. It was even more so back then. We needed to create an offering document, et cetera, et cetera. I had on paper made some money in the internet bubble, but it had all got away. And so I had a little bit of money saved. I mean, we'd done okay, but not a ton. And founding Foundry for me was an all-in moment, right? I took my entire life savings, which again was not a ton at the time, and put it on the table because it cost a lot of money to get all of that going. And obviously we had travel for fundraising, et cetera. And I think that you sort of have to think back to, this is 2006 when it kind of came together and decided to do it, 2007 when we were fundraising. There weren't emerging managers in the way that there are now. And we were 4 guys in Colorado that were trying to start a national venture capital firm. Also,
everything's in Silicon Valley. New York really barely hit the scene at this point, so it was an unconventional move to do this in Colorado for sure.
Absolutely, and you're right to point out, Nick, that it was really Silicon Valley based, right? I mean, there was nothing at all in New York that had sort of made its mark, right? I mean, Fred Wilson had started Union Square just before that. I mean, there were firms that would become iconic, but they weren't at that point. And the world was really centered around Silicon Valley. And the conventional wisdom amongst venture investors was you needed to be in one of the top like 5 or 6 names, or it sort of didn't.
How are you going to find the tech deals if you're not in California?
And the result of that was we started fundraising in January. By about May of 2007, it was pretty clear that it wasn't going to happen, right? We'd been turned down a bunch. We were sort of, I wouldn't say running out of people to call, but we'd had a lot of meetings and we'd not had a lot of results, right? We maybe had 5 or 10 million soft circled for what had, at the time, we were trying to make a $175 million fund. I actually remember coming home and talking to my wife about it and saying, hey, we're going to have to start over a little bit here. Like I think I lost the life savings. It wasn't a like, we're going to lose the house sort of moment, but it was a pretty existential, like, I don't know, I'm going to have to go get another job. I got to figure out what we're going to do. And it was tough. She was obviously super supportive and was like, mostly she was like, hey, I think it's going to come together. Give it a little bit more time. But I do very vividly remember that moment of like, I think I might have sort of blown it all up. And this was the culmination of several years of like having changed my trajectory, having taken salaries that were much, much lower than other offers I'd had because I wanted to be in venture and sort of, there were many moments there in that kind of spring of 2007 where I thought it wasn't going to come together. Now, what ended up happening was one big investor said, hey, I believe in you guys. I want 20% of your fund. And then all of a sudden, a whole bunch of other people said, oh, well, UTIMCO, the University of Texas wants in. I think we're pretty interested too. And we ended up raising $225 million. And so, but I tell that story because I think it's important, right? We really, it really didn't look like it was going to happen. I think sometimes people that are familiar with the venture world think like, well, Foundry was always successful, right? We manage almost $4.5 billion right now. And that, we sort of just snapped our figures and raised our first fund. And that really was not the case at all.
I think almost every entrepreneur in the world can relate to those moments that are just so scary where you're just not sure and you've done all this work and you had all the conviction and the agency and the planning and the strategy. And then it's just, there's this weird moment where there's just limbo for a while, and then it can all come together. And
you really have to believe in yourself, right? And by the way, sometimes even when you believe in yourself, it doesn't work out. So I'm not saying it's as simple as just like push through. But obviously I'm glad we pushed through, right? I mean, we were, because we had some conversations about, okay, how much longer are we going to do this before we decide there's just not a market for this?
Yep. Well, thank you for demystifying some of the myths around venture capital firms just pulling money out of thin air and immediately becoming successful. I think it's really good to hear that it's not easy on both sides. Let's talk a little bit about the venture capital space, because we've had a few angel investors on the podcast. But what is maybe a tip you would have for a first-time founder to make a good impression when meeting with a professional investor?
Well, let's back up from there, Nick, and just remind everyone who's listening that venture, in terms of the funding landscape, is tiny, right? It's 1% of companies take money from VCs, and the vast majority of companies shouldn't take money from a venture capitalist, and that's due to a bunch of different factors, right? It's not always the best deal for companies, right? There's a time frame to it, right? You've got VCs like me exist to eventually sell companies. Our funds have 10, 12-year lives, right? Some get extended a little bit, but still, even if it's 15, the clock starts ticking. And VCs get a lot of control over companies, no matter, if they buy 51% or 5% of the business. And so oftentimes for many entrepreneurs, it's not the right form of capital, because you really need to have a big idea that is going to grow and grow rapidly. And 66% of venture funded deals fail to return the capital that was invested in, right? So VCs make money on a small number of deals that are wildly successful. Now, there are many people listening who say, hey, that's what I want to do. That makes sense. And that's fine for them if they want to do that. But I just remind people that venture isn't always the way to go, right? There's bank financing, there's friends and family money, there's customer revenue, which is a really good way to fund your business, right? A lot of people start maybe and they do some consulting and they use that money, whatever it is. But there are other ways to fund a business and sort of bootstrap a little bit more. That could be maybe a better way for companies to grow. But to your question specifically, I mean, it's interesting to think about this, Nick. So we see at Foundry probably somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 business plans a year. So it's a lot. It's really hard to stand out in that. And I think that the answer is you want to think about quality over quantity, right? I mean, I've received notes of all different types. The worst ones are Dear Investor, or even worse, Dear John, right? They've forgotten to change who it's for, and it's a very generic, this is what I'm doing. The best ones are really thoughtful. Hey, Seth, I was reading The New Builders. This really resonated with me. I am actually doing something that's related to that, and I would love to get your advice on it. Something like that. And so I think that's the better approach is to do something that's meaningful and intentional. And I'm taking my own medicine on this. I mentioned before we started recording that I'm also a business founder. I'm starting a company right now, and we're in the process of reaching out to pre-seed investors. So Foundry is not a pre-seed investor, so it's a different universe than I necessarily work with, although I overlap with it. And we're doing the same thing, right? We're being very deliberate about who we're sending notes to. We're spending real time doing research. I might spend 10 or 15 minutes doing research on a venture firm before I actually write the note to them. Some of the note, of course, is the same to everyone because I'm describing the business that we're working on, but a bunch of the note is very specific to what I work. And I think that that's a better approach.
That makes a lot of sense. And thank you for reminding our listeners that the funding landscape is wide and broad, and venture is definitely a very specific type of funding. It's and like you said, I think it's so important for founders to really explore the entire breadth of different ways that they can finance their businesses. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But speaking of your book, you were just recently a new published author, and the book is called The New Builders. Tell us a little bit about this book, and I know this is something really near and dear to your heart, and maybe you can kind of tie it into this new business you're launching, because I think in many ways it's quite mission aligned with the work we do here at skyslimit.org.
Yeah, and I would imagine it very mission aligned, and I think that I hope that it will resonate with your listeners as well. I mean, really, the New Builders describes a landscape of people starting businesses in the U.S. It's a sort of U.S. focused book that is much more diverse than I think people give it credit for, and much more centered away from the venture market, right? And we talk about that when 99% of businesses aren't venture backed. And that's not to take anything away from venture-backed businesses. Very important. They power many of those 99% businesses. But the truth is that women and people of color and immigrants are starting businesses at significantly higher rates than white men. And you wouldn't really know that if you read the business press in the United States, which is much more venture-focused. Venture has a diversity challenge, diversity problem. And so many of the stories of the founders that you hear about are stories of white men. But the truth is, if you look more broadly across the startup landscape, all sorts of different businesses, the kind of business that you might pass if you walk down Main Street in your hometown, those businesses are significantly more likely to be started by women and people of color. Women start 4 times the number of businesses that men. 64% of businesses started by women are started by Black women specifically. Black women are the single fastest growing cohort of new entrepreneurs in the United States. And then immigrants are also about twice as likely to start businesses as people born in the U.S. For a bunch of different reasons. But and again, that's not to take anything away from the people listening that are saying, "Hey, I'm starting a business, and I'm you look like you and me." Of course, there's plenty of those as well. But the story just hadn't really been told of entrepreneurs that were a bit more diverse. And so we felt, my co-author Elizabeth McBride and I felt like that was a story that needed to be talked about. And interestingly, part of that story was that entrepreneurship in the United States was lagging, and we actually were struggling with business starts, net new business starts in the United States, really for the first time, sort of in the history that we count, right? So that's about 80 years of history, and we describe in the book. One of the reasons is access to capital, right? We don't do a good job of getting capital to new builders, to people that look like new builders, like the people that are starting businesses. And we talk about the implications of that pretty deeply in the book. And you mentioned the business that I'm in the process of starting, and it's really to address that, right? We did a book tour, as one does. And I would often say on the book tour, like, hey, there's a big business to be built here if someone can figure out how to better finance new builder businesses, because they struggle for financing, right? And in large part, that's because the communities from which they pull capital don't have the resources that other communities that had historically started businesses had, right? As you, I'm sure, know, the average Black family has 1/10 the wealth, the average white family, the average Hispanic family has 1/7 the wealth, the average white family. These disparities shrink a little bit, but they're still huge, even when you control for income of head of household and education of head of household. This is not a who has the best jobs kind of thing. This is a 400, 500, 600 years worth of systematic racism results in these massive wealth gaps. We're not going to fix that overnight. But if you're a Black female founder and you're going to your community to raise a little bit of money, that community doesn't have as much money on average as, me going as a white male founder.
Filling that gap is just so critical to the American economy in supporting the next generation of American entrepreneurship. And like you said, small businesses and these new startups are the ones that clothe, that feed us, they provide the services, they become bigger businesses, they reinvest in their communities. It creates this cycle of wealth creation that's so critical for us. And also, most new jobs are actually created in these small and medium-sized enterprises and businesses across the United States. It's a myth that big, giant companies actually stimulate the economy. We need a lot more small businesses that look a lot more like the composition of our society to be supported, to get access to capital, and to grow their businesses heading into the next century. And so I'm a big fan of what you guys are doing. Talk to us a little bit about how you're going to approach solving this problem on the business side with this new company. If I can mention it, we would love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I'm starting a business with a partner, a business called Good Bread. And we're going to try to address this. Now, it doesn't address the 0-day problem, which is, I think, a separate problem. And I know that one that you guys at Sky's the Limit are really thinking about. And by the way, you're 100% right. There have been a number of studies that have shown that 100%, some cases more than 100% of net new job growth comes from small business. So it's a critical part of the U.S. economy. And by the way, it's 50% of employment and 42% of GDP. So it's also, they individually are small, but together they're mighty, right? And I think that's something that people sometimes forget. And so anyway, but to good bread. So we're going to try to find a way to solve the financing problem for small businesses. And what we heard when we were researching the new builders over and over and over again was many of these businesses need relatively modest amount of money, right? $5,000 to $100,000. And unfortunately, that doesn't really work in the U.S. banking system, right? It's not the way that banks think about the market. They're not able to make loan sizes for the most part. CDFIs are a little bit of an exception, but to make loans in that size. If you look at the SBA data, right, the average SBA loan, right, which is a great way to raise money if you can, but the average SBA loan is nearly $600,000, right? That's out of the reach of most businesses. And again, the truth is that small businesses are actually not the ones that are, even though there's an S in the SBA, that are not the ones largely accessing that capital. So anyway, our hope is to change that by creating a underwriting methodology that blends financial underwriting, so traditional, what's your credit score kind of stuff, with character-based underwriting. We've been working on a model that we've put together that we hope will be quite predictive of people's propensity to repay, right? Its grittiness, its likelihood, its obligation to repay, things like that we measure across an inventory of about 100 or so questions. And so we're going to try to combine those two things in an application that is relatively easy to manage and maneuver for small businesses, so we can make quick financing decisions, and we can kind of get into that sweet spot of, let's say $25,000 to $75,000 loan size. And the kind of things we're talking about are, you are a trainer, and you want to open your first gym, right? You
need $600,000 to do that. You need a smaller amount of money to test that idea out.
100%, right? You own a food truck and you want to buy a second one, right? You are a restaurateur and you need to, upgrade your, your kitchen. Things like that are the types of things that we plan to fund with this money. So that's the idea. We're in the process of raising our own capital for that. In our case, we are going to VCs for that, as I mentioned. And so, we're very early in that process, but our hope is to get it launched soon.
Amazing. Well, we're rooting for you guys, and we'll be keeping a keen eye on that project, and hope to check back in with you at some point to talk more about how it can support early stage entrepreneurs from across the country. I think we'll have time for one or two more questions, being conscious of our time here. So I want to ask something. We share a few mutual points of contact, and one of the things I always like to ask people about is, who is an important mentor in your career, and maybe talk to us a little bit about the relationship and how it helped you across different times of hardship or growth for you personally.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to point to anyone other than Brad. I mean, I've had some great mentors over my life, but Brad Feld, who's still now my partner, has been instrumental in my life and career. I learned a lot about business from him. I learned the craft of venture capital by, sort of running around with him as his associate and going to board meetings. And I've learned a lot about life from him, and just in terms of how he approaches things. And he's just, I just obviously I had the great fortune of spending time with someone who I think is going to go down as, one of the greatest venture capitalists of our generation. And so given that that's, what I've devoted now 22 years to, and in terms of a career, I couldn't imagine a better mentor than Brad. And it's interesting too, because our relationship has evolved, right? I mean, I started by working for him. And then we became partners, but it took me a little while to feel like I was really his partner. And then I went into a period where I felt like, God, I'm just constantly living in
inferiority complex.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I eventually actually wrote something about this. I called it shadow boxing, and I described this sort of like getting over that, right? Like realizing that it wasn't a competition, and that I didn't need to become Brad. I needed to be my own person. And I think that's when I stopped worrying about how famous Brad was, but I wasn't, and, whatever, like in the venture world. And it just sort of decided to focus on the stuff that I cared about. And that, I think, was both helpful for me, helpful for our relationship. And, Brad and I have been business partners now for 20 something years, and we're very, very close friends. So anyway, that's probably a longer answer than you wanted, but definitely.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. That's very cool to hear about. All right, maybe one last question here. Entrepreneurship can seem very scary to anyone sort of taking that step, to go test it out, to try their idea and see whether or not it gets traction. What tips would you give our listeners for how to maybe manage some of the stress that comes with running their own business or taking that leap and switching their context and getting a little bit uncomfortable with changes in their lives?
Yeah, so it's funny. You had prepped me with a few questions. I thought you were going to ask me about sort of one of the books I read recently that really resonated with me. But actually, the answer, I think, will dovetail with this as I think about it. In part because I think sometimes you can hear me talk for 30 seconds on something, but maybe reading more about it. I read a lot, and so I had a few to choose from. But one that really resonated with me, and I think this is important for entrepreneurs as well, was a book called Subtract. It's by an author called Letty Klotz. And it really talks about when mostly humans are wired to think about adding, right? What more can I do? I can change something. I should add something to what I'm doing. And this is the part that's responsive to your question about sort of how to manage your time in your life as an entrepreneur. And I think that, and I definitely fall prey to this, which is maybe why the book resonated with me so well, because it made me orient my thinking to maybe, and I'm not talking about I'm going to take a vacation in there that I'm going to do less. I'm talking about long-term changes to what you're doing. Yeah, maybe you need to add something. Maybe that's a walk every day or a meditation or something like that. But maybe it's also taking some things away, right? You're trying to do too much. And so I would say that and this is true not just from entrepreneurs, but for all of the people I know, I often, sort of listen to them talk about something they're stressed about. And I think, what could they not be doing, right? And then I realize when I'm complaining to someone, they're probably having the same sort of dialogue in their own heads. And I've started trying to ask myself that question. Hey, is the answer to what I'm doing to add something to my life? Or is it really to create simplicity and take some complexity out? So I'd recommend that as a concept and that book.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Seth. Now I'm going to be thinking about that all weekend. Really appreciate it. Okay. Well, really appreciate your time today. And I'm sure our listeners will be grateful for all the wisdom that was shared. At skyslimit.org, we connect underrepresented entrepreneurs with volunteer business professionals for free. One-on-one mentoring. We also provide guides to all of our members, monthly funding opportunities, so you can sign up today for free. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe and share. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the First Buck Podcast. Don't forget to join the community of underrepresented entrepreneurs and their supporters by signing up at skysthelimit.org. Click subscribe, and we'll see you next time.